There's a moment in everyone's professional life where the ground shifts beneath you so suddenly that you don't even realize it's happened until you're already miles away. For me, that moment happened on a Monday morning in October, in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a glass building in downtown Chicago. But the real story doesn't start there. It starts 3 months earlier, on a call I almost didn't take. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm in my mid-40s now, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life at Thornfield Industries, a mid-size manufacturing company that most people have never heard of, but absolutely depends on. I'm the Director of Business Development, or I was. But before we get to that part, you need to understand what I actually did. When I started at Thornfield, the company was solid but not exceptional. We had steady revenue, good products, a loyal workforce, but what we didn't have was real vision for growth. I walked in as a young guy in his 30s, hungry, ambitious, and honestly pretty convinced I was going to change the world. I was naive enough to believe it, and that naivety turned out to be my greatest asset. Over the next decade and a half, I did something that sounds simple in theory, but takes something close to a religious devotion in practice. I built relationships. Not business relationships. I'm talking about real ones. The kind where you know a guy's daughter graduated from Northwestern, where you remember that his wife had back surgery 2 years ago, and you ask her about the recovery. Where you go to his company's Christmas party and you actually want to be there. Where you've had drinks with him, real drinks, the kind where you talk about things that matter. I worked with 6 major clients. These weren't just contracts with account numbers and quarterly review meetings. These were the firms that generated 70% of our revenue. 70%. Every major decision the company made, every strategic pivot, every risk we took or didn't take, was fundamentally dependent on keeping those 6 relationships intact and thriving. I knew their business models inside and out. Better than some of their own executives knew them, honestly. I could walk into a meeting with their CFO and talk about margin compression in their third quarter performance. I could sit down with their operations director and discuss supply chain bottlenecks they hadn't even told their CEO about yet. I'd walked some of these guys through genuine crises. I'd introduced 2 of them to each other, which eventually turned into a partnership that saved one of them from actual bankruptcy. These weren't favor relationships. These were trust relationships built over 15 years of consistent, genuine interest in their success. The company thrived. We grew steadily. We never had a major client loss. We expanded our operations, hired more people, invested in better equipment. The owner, Gerald Thornfield, was a good man. He'd built the company from nothing in the 70s, and by the time I arrived, he was more interested in running a solid, profitable business than in chasing growth at all costs. He was in his 50s when I started, and the company made him wealthy but not ridiculously wealthy. It was a good thing, a stable thing. But Gerald was getting older. That's just the nature of life. He had a son named Tyler, who was bright, ambitious, and most importantly, who wanted nothing to do with the family business for most of his life. Tyler went to Harvard Business School, got his MBA, and spent his 20s working at consulting firms and tech startups in Silicon Valley. He was smart in that particular MBA way, full of frameworks and buzzwords and ideas about disruption and market positioning. The kind of smart that looks impressive in a PowerPoint, but doesn't necessarily mean you understand how actual people and actual relationships work. Then something shifted. I don't know if Tyler had a business failure, or if he got tired of the startup hustle, or if he just realized that sometimes the boring family business is actually the better play. Whatever it was, around the time he turned 28, he started circling back. He wanted a real role at Thornfield. He wanted to be involved. He wanted to matter. This would have been fine, normal even, except for one thing. Gerald, wanting to be a good father and believing that his son deserved a real opportunity, decided to bring in a professional CEO, someone to run the day-to-day operations, someone with corporate gravitas, someone who could mentor his son and help integrate him into the business in a thoughtful way. Enter David Harrington. David was in his late 50s, polished, accomplished in that corporate executive way. He'd come from bigger companies. He had the suit and tie gravitas that makes boards feel comfortable. He was hired 4 years before this whole thing came to a head. On paper, he made sense. In practice, David was playing a different game than Gerald understood. From day one, I could tell that David saw the company the way a CEO at a larger corporation does. He wasn't thinking about sustainability. He was thinking about growth, about making a mark, about positioning himself for the next thing. He was smart enough to be respectful to me in public, but I could feel the friction. He wanted to reorganize things. He wanted to streamline. He wanted to apply standard corporate operating procedures to a company that had been successful precisely because it didn't operate like a standard corporation. For 3 years, I basically ignored him. I did my job. I maintained my relationships. I brought in renewal contracts. I developed new business. I made sure our key clients were happy and had everything they needed. The company kept growing. We kept making money. Life went on. And then everything started shifting. Harrington started spending more time with Gerald. They'd have long lunches. Harrington would send him articles about corporate succession planning and professional management structures. More importantly, Harrington started cultivating a relationship with Tyler. They'd have coffee together. They'd talk about the future of the company. They'd discuss modernizing things, bringing in new talent, moving away from the old relationship-based model that Gerald had built the company on. I saw it happening, but I didn't feel threatened. I was good at what I did. I had relationships that couldn't be replicated. I was making excellent money. I had security and respect, or so I thought. In July, 3 months before that fateful Monday morning meeting, I got a call. It came during lunch. I was sitting at a desk in our offices, looking out over the Chicago skyline, eating a sandwich I'd picked up from a deli downstairs. The call came from Richard Chen, the CEO of Meridian Group. Meridian was our biggest competitor. They were larger, more ambitious, and they'd been trying to hire people away from us for years. I'd always ignored those overtures. Why would I leave? I was established here. I had history. I had comfort. But Richard's call was different. He didn't call to offer me a job. He called because he wanted me to understand something. He said, "Marcus, we've watched what you've done at Thornfield for 15 years. We know what your relationships are worth. We know how your clients feel about you. And we know that you're about to be pushed out." I told him he was wrong. I told him I had security, that I was valued, that the owner appreciated me. Richard listened to me explain why I was comfortable, and then he said something I couldn't unhear. "Gerald's not running the company anymore. David is. And David sees you as a threat because you have what he's trying to build, actual client relationships. You're more valuable to those clients than the company is. That scares him." I hung up the phone. I told myself Richard was wrong. I went back to my sandwich. But then I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention. I noticed that Harrington had been having meetings with my clients. Not with me present. Solo meetings where he was introducing himself as the company's strategic leader. I noticed that he was asking them questions about their relationships with me, about whether they'd follow me elsewhere, about who their key contacts were besides me. He was running interference. I mentioned it to one of my oldest clients, Jim Patterson. Jim had been working with me for 12 years. We weren't just business contacts. I'd played golf with him. I'd met his kids. I knew that his wife had MS and that it had been a rough few years for them. I asked Jim casually if everything was okay, if there were any concerns about our service. Jim paused. There's a specific kind of pause that people do when they're about to tell you something they've been rehearsing. He said, "Marcus, I'm going to be straight with you because I respect you." David Harrington came to my office last week and basically told me that the company was moving in a new direction. He said that you were being moved upstairs to a strategic advisory role, and that we should expect to be working with his team going forward. He was very smooth about it, very professional, but he was definitely telling me that our relationship with you was over. That's when I started making calls. I called Richard Chen back the same day. I told him I wanted to talk, not about a job offer, about an actual opportunity, about what he envisioned, what he was willing to invest, and what he thought we could build together. Over the next 3 months, Richard and I had a series of conversations. They were serious conversations. He brought in Meridian's CFO, their COO, their other senior executives. They showed me their financials, their strategy, their growth projections. They showed me their client list and asked me honestly whether I thought our major clients would be open to expanding their relationships with Meridian if I was there to facilitate those conversations. I was honest with them. I told them that I couldn't speak for anyone else, that I couldn't promise anything, but I also told them the truth, which was that the relationships I'd built were real, and that those clients respected my judgment, and that if I genuinely believed Meridian was the better place to work, then some of them would likely follow. We negotiated a package, a significant salary increase, equity stake in the company, my own team that I'd be building from scratch, a real partnership, not just a title. It took 3 months of back and forth, lawyers on both sides, careful negotiations. But by early October, we had a deal. I signed the offer letter on a Sunday evening. I remember sitting at my dining room table with a glass of bourbon, reading through the agreement one more time. This was a commitment. This was leaving behind 15 years of stability for something new. This was betting on myself and on Richard's vision, and on the belief that the client relationships I'd built were genuinely mine and not just artifacts of the Thornfield name. I thought about calling someone. My wife said I should call Gerald, tell him directly, given the courtesy. But I decided against it. I decided to wait, to resign properly, to do this the right way. So I signed. I put my signature on that offer letter, and I took a screenshot, and I sent it to Richard, and I went to bed. The next morning, Monday, I drove into the office like I always did. I had no idea that David Harrington had already scheduled the meeting that would change everything. It came through the calendar invite at 9:15 a.m. Strategic Alignment Meeting, the subject line said. Conference Room A, 10 a.m. Senior leadership, board members, key managers. It didn't sound unusual. We had these meetings occasionally. They were usually about quarterly performance or upcoming strategic initiatives. I grabbed my coffee and my notebook and headed down the hallway. Conference Room A was already full. Gerald was there, sitting at the head of the table, looking a bit uncomfortable the way older guys do in formal corporate settings. David Harrington was at the other end, setting up a presentation on the projector. Board members were scattered around. A few other executives and managers I knew were taking seats. Tyler wasn't there yet. David started the meeting the way corporate meetings usually start, with some pleasantries about performance and market conditions. He talked about the company's trajectory, about the changing competitive landscape, about the need to accelerate growth and modernize our organizational structure. And then he turned to me. Marcus, thank you for building such strong relationships with our key accounts. That foundation has been invaluable. But as we look forward, we need to be thinking about scalability, about systems, about processes that don't depend on individual relationships. I just listened. I didn't interrupt. He continued. We're announcing a leadership restructure today. It's a change that positions us for the next phase of growth. Marcus, we're moving you into a senior advisor role. You'll focus on strategic consulting and relationship transition support. You won't have direct management responsibilities, but you'll be available to counsel the team as needed. The room was quiet. And we're very pleased, David continued, to announce that Tyler Thornfield is joining our leadership team as the new Director of Business Development. Tyler brings fresh perspective, innovative thinking, and a deep commitment to Thornfield's future. Tyler walked in then, right on cue. He was wearing a suit that looked expensive. He had the Harvard MBA confidence. He smiled at everyone in the room like he'd just won something. "You're not as valuable as you think, Marcus," David said in front of everyone, in that calm, professional CEO tone. "The company needs fresh energy and new approaches to drive growth." The room was still quiet. I looked around at the faces. I could see discomfort. I could see shock. I could see people not knowing what to do with this information. And I smiled. It wasn't a hurt smile or an angry smile. It was a calm, quiet, completely genuine smile. The kind of smile you get when you're thinking about something that brings you genuine peace. It was the smile of someone who had already decided to leave and was now watching the consequences of a decision that had already been made. David saw the smile and misinterpreted it. He thought I was accepting it. He thought I was the kind of person who would sit there, take the demotion, and find gratitude in whatever scraps of dignity were being offered. He was wrong. I didn't say anything during the meeting. I didn't defend myself or express shock or do any of the things that make sense in that moment. I just sat there and listened as David explained the new reporting structure, as he outlined Tyler's responsibilities, as he talked about how excited he was about the future. When the meeting ended, people stood up awkwardly. Gerald looked at me with something like guilt in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just looked away. I walked out of that conference room and went back to my office. It was 10:47 a.m. I had just been demoted in front of a room full of people. My career at Thornfield Industries was, for all practical purposes, over. I sat at my desk for 5 minutes and didn't do anything. I just sat there, looking out at the Chicago skyline. And then I pulled up my email and typed one sentence. "Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position at Thornfield Industries. Thank you for the opportunity." I sent it to David, to Gerald, to HR, and to the board. One sentence, no explanation, no drama, just clarity. Then I packed my personal items into a box. There weren't many. A few photos, a couple of awards from clients over the years, my coffee mug. The things that matter at an office are never the things that matter in life. I walked out of the building at 11:30 a.m., got in my car in the parking garage, and drove to Meridian Group's offices. When I walked in, Richard was waiting. He took one look at my face and he knew. "You did it," he said. "I did it," I said. That was Monday. By Wednesday, the calls started coming in. The first one was from Jim Patterson. He said, "Marcus, David Harrington called me this morning to schedule a meeting to go over our account." What the hell happened? I told him the truth. I told him I'd been demoted. I told him I'd resigned. I told him I was at Meridian now, and that I'd love to explore whether we could work together in this new context. But I also told him I wasn't calling to pitch him or pressure him. I was just letting him know. Jim said, "I'm calling an emergency meeting with my board today. I'll be back to you by tomorrow." That was the thing about those relationships. They were real enough that when I left, they noticed. Not as a contract issue, but as a personal thing. Jim Patterson had worked with me for 12 years because he liked me and because he believed in our partnership. When I left, it created a genuine gap. The second call came from Susan Walsh at Benchmark Manufacturing. Susan had been my client for 10 years. She said, "I heard through the grapevine that you left Thornfield. Is that true?" I told her yes. I told her why. I told her I was at Meridian and that I understood completely if she wanted to keep her business with Thornfield, but that I'd love to talk about whether Meridian could add value to her operation. Susan paused, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Marcus, I don't work with Thornfield because they have great products. I work with them because of you. You understand my business. You care about my success. If you're at Meridian now, then I want to talk about how we can shift our relationship." That was Wednesday. Back at Thornfield, things were starting to unravel, though probably nobody realized it yet. Tyler had shown up on Tuesday morning, ready to be the new director of business development. He had a whole plan. He'd reorganized the account structure. He'd created new documentation and process flows. He'd set up a new CRM system. He was moving fast, which is what people with MBAs think being a leader means. On Tuesday afternoon, he called Jim Patterson and asked for a meeting. Jim took the call out of professional courtesy, but Jim was already in discussions with me about switching to Meridian. When Tyler got on the phone talking about synergies and value-add propositions and integrated solutions frameworks, Jim was polite, but Jim was done. Wednesday morning, Tyler scheduled a lunch with Robert Chen, Thornfield's longest-standing client. 12 years. Robert had been with me since the beginning, since I was still trying to figure out what I was doing. But Robert was also someone who appreciated respect and consistency. He'd built his business on relationships with people he could trust. Tyler showed up to the lunch with PowerPoint slides on his phone. He wanted to show Robert how Thornfield's approach was moving forward. Robert was polite, but Robert was calling me by Thursday. By the end of that first week, Harrington was starting to understand that something had gone wrong. He didn't know the details yet, but he could feel it. Client meetings were being rescheduled. There were strange gaps in communication. When he tried to reach Jim Patterson, Jim's assistant said Jim was evaluating our options. That's when David made his first big mistake. He called me. I was in my new office at Meridian. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Richard had given me a corner space with windows and a door that closed. I was in the middle of a call with Susan Walsh when David's name came up on my phone. I let Susan go and called him back. "Marcus," David said, his voice different now, tighter. "We need to talk about this resignation. I think we can work something out. Maybe the senior advisor role didn't give you the right sense of scope. Maybe we can restructure it." I let him finish. "David," I said, "there's nothing to restructure. I'm at Meridian now, and I'm already working with our key clients to transition their relationships. This was always going to happen once you made the choice you made." "You're interfering with our accounts," David said. "No," I said. "I'm telling my clients where I work now. What they do with that information is their choice." "They won't all follow you," David said. "No," I agreed. "Probably not all of them, but enough will. Because the relationship was always with me, David. That's the thing about real relationships. They're not transferable." I hung up the phone. By mid-October, 3 weeks after that meeting, we had signed contracts with 4 of Thornfield's 6 major clients. Not all at once. It was quiet and methodical. A contract renewal came up with Jim Patterson's company, and Jim asked if Meridian could bid on it. They could, and they did, and they won it. A new project came up at Benchmark Manufacturing that required equipment that Thornfield had always provided. Susan asked if Meridian could handle it. We could, and we did. 2 of the smaller accounts came along because they followed where the bigger ones went. By November, Thornfield had lost 70% of their revenue. 70%. The exact amount that I'd built over 15 years. The exact amount that David had been so confident he could replace with fresh energy and innovative thinking. What happened next was painful to watch, even from a distance. David Harrington's position became untenable. He'd made a single, catastrophic miscalculation, and there was no recovery from it. The board had questions. Gerald had questions. The company's financial projections had to be completely revised. There was a board meeting in late November. I heard about it secondhand through some mutual contacts, so I don't know all the details. But the general shape was this. David's contract was terminated. He got a severance package, and walked out with whatever professional dignity he had left. He sent an email to the company saying something about pursuing other opportunities and grateful for the experience. Tyler, to his credit, had enough self-awareness to realize that he'd been handed something he wasn't ready for. He didn't fight the outcome. He didn't blame anyone else. He just stepped back and let the adults in the room figure out the business. He actually reached out to me about 6 months later, not to beg or make excuses, but just to acknowledge that he'd learned something about himself. I respect that about him. Most people never get that kind of clarity. Gerald Thornfield was devastated. He'd built a company over 50 years, and in the span of a few months, it had fundamentally changed because of decisions he'd outsourced to someone he didn't fully understand. He brought in an interim CEO from outside. He started rebuilding. The company survived, but it was much smaller now, much less ambitious, focused on the core business and the remaining loyal clients. I don't know all of what happened after that because I was focused on my own thing, but I know it was painful. What I do know is what happened at Meridian. I started building there the way I'd built at Thornfield, except this time I did it with resources and support, and a genuine partner in Richard Chen. We brought on the 4 major accounts, and then we started growing beyond them. We invested in infrastructure, in people, in systems that could scale without losing the personal element that mattered. Within the first year, we'd doubled the business. Within 2 years, I'd built a team of 20 people who all understood what I understood, which was that business at this level isn't about products and prices. It's about trust and consistency and genuine interest in people's success. I'm in my mid-40s now, and I've been at Meridian for 2 years. I'm more engaged in my work than I've been since my 30s. The pay is significantly better. The equity stake means that when the company does well, I actually benefit from that in a real way, not just in terms of a bonus that gets taxed away. But beyond the material stuff, there's something else. There's the daily experience of being somewhere that values what I actually bring. There's the experience of walking into meetings with clients where they're genuinely happy to see me, where they're not wondering if I'm about to be replaced by someone's ambitious son. There's the experience of building something with people who get it, who understand that in business, the only real asset is trust. Looking back on those 15 years at Thornfield, I don't regret them. I built something real there. I helped create value for clients and for the company. I grew as a person and as a professional. I made good money and I had stable employment, and I had the respect of people who mattered. But I also learned something crucial about corporate loyalty. It's not the same as genuine partnership. One is about what you can do for the company. The other is about mutual value and respect, and the understanding that both people are committing their talents and their time because it serves both of them. When David Harrington decided to push me out, he wasn't just pushing me out. He was pushing out 15 years of relationship building and client management and consistent performance. He was betting that fresh energy and an MBA from Harvard could replace something that took over a decade to build. And he lost that bet completely. The smile I gave in that meeting wasn't about acceptance or resignation. It was about understanding that the ground had already shifted. It was about knowing that the future was already written. It was about the quiet confidence that comes from having already made your decision and having that decision validated by events outside of anyone's control. That's the real story here. It's not a story about corporate betrayal, though there was some of that. It's not a story about vindication, though I got to experience some of that too. It's a story about the true value of genuine relationships and about the consequences of confusing corporate positions with actual power. I had the relationships. The accounts followed me because they'd chosen to work with me, not with the company. When I left, they had to make a choice, and they chose to follow. That choice wasn't about loyalty to me or about revenge against Thornfield. It was about understanding, at a deep level, that the thing they valued most in our business relationship was something I owned, not the company. It was the trust. It was the consistency. It was the genuine interest in their success. David Harrington didn't understand that. He thought client relationships were things you could just reassign to someone else, like accounts in a spreadsheet. He thought a position on an organizational chart meant something real. He thought that announcing a restructure would somehow transfer the value that came from 15 years of relationship building. He was catastrophically wrong. And when I smiled in that meeting, it was because I already knew that. I'd already signed with Meridian. I'd already had conversations with my clients. I'd already understood that the real value I'd created wasn't something that could be taken away by a CEO with delusions of corporate power. The ground had already shifted. The future had already been written. I was just in the process of living it out.